The most dangerous form of control doesn't always sound aggressive. Sometimes it sounds like nothing. No reply, no reaction, no acknowledgement. Just silence, used with precision. Because when someone ignores you on purpose, they're not just creating distance, they're creating uncertainty. And uncertainty is where the mind starts to chase, doubt, and obey. That's the trick. Silence forces you to fill in the blanks. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I'm the problem. And the moment you start rewriting reality, they gain leverage. Ignoring someone can become a weapon because it punishes without proof. No insult, no threat, nothing you can point to. But somehow you still feel smaller, weaker, and desperate to fix it. And that's what makes it powerful. The person using silence doesn't need to chase control because they make you hand it over. But this is only the beginning of the game. Ignoring works because the brain hates unfinished emotional patterns. A door left half open, a sentence never completed, a connection suddenly withdrawn. Your mind doesn't rest. It hunts for closure. So you replay every detail, every text, every look, every pause. Not because they said something powerful, but because they left you alone with questions powerful enough to control you. And the silence hits harder when it feels intentional. When you know they saw you. When you know they could respond, but choose not to. That choice becomes the message. This is where power shifts. You stop focusing on what they did and start focusing on how to win their attention back. That's the trap. You move toward them while losing ground inside yourself, because the real damage isn't the silence itself. It's what the silence makes you do to yourself. And once you understand that, the tactic starts losing its grip. The first people silence controls are the ones who still believe every disconnect must be repaired immediately. They confuse absence with urgency and urgency with responsibility. So they reach, they explain, they soften their tone, they send one more message they didn't owe. And with every extra effort, the imbalance becomes easier to exploit. That's why ignoring is so effective in unstable relationships. One person is trying to restore peace. The other is studying how much silence it takes to make that happen. And once that pattern is learned, silence stops being accidental. It becomes behavioral conditioning, a lesson, a warning, a quiet way of teaching you what happens when you disappoint them. But the moment you see the pattern, the spell weakens. Because now it's no longer silence. Now it's strategy. And strategy can be recognized. And the strategy becomes even more dangerous when it's inconsistent. Not constant silence. Selective silence. Warm one moment, distant the next. Just enough attention to keep you attached. That's what confuses the nervous system. You don't just fear the distance, you start craving the return. And the return feels so relieving, you forget to question why the pain was created. Now attention becomes reward. Silence becomes punishment. And without realizing it, you're being trained, not through logic, not through truth, but through emotional timing. This is why some people seem impossible to let go of. It's not always love, it's not always meaning. Sometimes it's just a cycle of deprivation and relief dressed up as connection. And if you never name the cycle, you keep calling it chemistry. But in the next part, the pattern gets darker because silence is rarely working alone. Because silence becomes far more effective when it's paired with something else. Ambiguity. No clear reason, no direct explanation. Just enough confusion to keep you mentally trapped. Maybe they were caring yesterday. Maybe they sounded close last week. Maybe they said just enough to make you doubt your own instincts today. That's how confusion protects control. And if you confront it, they often don't deny the distance. They minimize it. You're overthinking. You're too sensitive. Suddenly the silence isn't the issue anymore. You are. That's when the tactic deepens. First, they create emotional pain through distance. Then they make you question whether you even had the right to feel it. And once pain and self-doubt start working together, silence no longer feels passive. It becomes psychological pressure. Invisible, but incredibly effective. Psychological pressure works best when it stays invisible, no bruises, no raised voices, nothing dramatic enough for outsiders to notice, just a slow erosion of your inner certainty. That's why this tactic is so hard to explain. From the outside, it looks small, but from the inside, it changes your behavior, your confidence, and eventually your sense of self. You become more careful, more filtered, more strategic, not because you've grown wiser, but because you're trying to avoid another emotional disappearance you were never meant to fear. This is where the damage becomes internal. You don't need them to silence you anymore. You start doing it for them. Automatically, quietly, efficiently. And that's the real goal of silent control, not to win one moment, but to reshape your future reactions. But there's one signal that exposes the entire game. The clearest sign you're being controlled by silence is simple. You stop asking what they're doing and start obsessing over how to keep them comfortable. You measure your tone. You monitor your timing. You edit your honesty before it even leaves your mouth, and you call it maturity when it's really fear dressed as discipline. You start apologizing faster, explaining longer, accepting less, not because you became more loving, but because your nervous system learned that honesty might cost you connection. That is the hidden cost. Silence doesn't just affect the moment it happens. It teaches your body to anticipate abandonment before it even arrives. And once your body starts predicting the punishment, the manipulator barely has to do anything at all, which leads to the most dangerous part of this tactic. The most dangerous phase begins when silence is no longer needed as punishment, because by then the threat of silence is enough, and that threat lives inside you. You silence your own needs before they can be rejected. You hide your disappointment before it can be mocked. You abandon yourself early to avoid being abandoned later. That's why this tactic is so devastating. It doesn't just make you anxious, it teaches you to participate in your own shrinking, to become easier to manage. And from the outside, the manipulator may look calm, composed, even mature. But control often looks peaceful when the other person has learned not to resist. So if the relationship feels calm only when you stay small, silent, and careful, that isn't peace, it's compliance. And now the question becomes, how do you break it? You break silent control the moment you stop treating confusion like a command. Not every silence deserves pursuit. Not every distance deserves your self-betrayal. The first shift is internal. You stop asking, how do I make them respond? And start asking, what does this pattern reveal about the dynamic I'm in? Then comes the harder part, responding without begging, chasing, or collapsing, calm observation, clear boundaries, and the willingness to let silence expose what words try to hide. Because once you stop performing panic, the tactic loses efficiency. It can still hurt, but it stops shaping you, it stops training you, it stops owning the room, and that's the real reversal, not forcing them to come back, but refusing to disappear inside their silence. Because in the final part, we uncover the deepest truth of all. The deepest truth about silence is this: it only controls the part of you that still believes your worth can be withdrawn by someone else. That's why this tactic cuts so deep. It doesn't just touch loneliness, it touches the old fear that being unseen means being unimportant. But the moment you stop begging silence to explain itself, something changes. You stop performing for attention. You stop negotiating with absence. You return to yourself. And that's what silent manipulators fear most. Not your anger, not your words, but your detachment. Because once you no longer chase meaning from their withdrawal, the game ends. So remember, silence can be a weapon, but only if you mistake it for truth. See the pattern, name the tactic, and it loses the power to define you. If this changed the way you see silence, imagine what the next video will do. Subscribe to Psych Atlas and watch the next one now, because the people who understand these patterns always see the game first.